Welcome back to Vibe Podcast. Today we're discussing the shooting of Stephen Waldorf, a topic researched for us by David Morgan. I'm joined by Charles and Angela.
Hello, Alice. Charles here, a former Metropolitan Police officer and now a criminology expert. I'll be looking at this from the perspective of police procedures and the immense pressures officers face.
And I'm Angela, a human rights lawyer from the U.S. specializing in police shootings. My focus today will be on the critical issues of accountability, the use of force, and the rights of the individual in such a tragic situation.
Thank you both. So, to set the scene for our listeners, the shooting of Stephen Waldorf in January 1983 was a truly shocking event. He was shot and seriously injured by police who mistook him for a dangerous escaped criminal, David Martin. Charles, perhaps you could start by giving us some background on just how dangerous David Martin was, to give context to the police operation.
Absolutely, Alice. To understand the officer's mindset, you first have to grasp who David Martin was. This wasn't just any common criminal. Martin was a very violent individual, a thief and fraudster with a history of carrying firearms. He'd served a long prison sentence, had previously shot a police officer, and was known for resisting arrest violently and attempting multiple escapes. In fact, he'd escaped custody in December '82 after stealing 24 revolvers and almost 1,000 rounds of ammunition. He was, to put it plainly, considered extremely dangerous, a genuine threat to public safety and police lives. The pressure on the Met to recapture him was immense.
And while that background certainly highlights the perceived threat, Charles, it doesn't excuse the actions that led to Stephen Waldorf being shot 5 times. The text describes Detective Constable Finch firing all 6 rounds from his revolver, first at the tires, then at the passenger. And then, as Waldorf slumped, 2 more officers opened fire, ultimately firing a total of 14 shots. 14 shots. This wasn't just a mistake, this was an egregious use of excessive force, regardless of who they thought they were confronting.
I agree the number of shots is deeply concerning, Angela. But from an operational standpoint, it highlights how quickly a situation can spiral out of control in high-stress, dynamic environments. Finch was the only officer who had actually met Martin. When he approached the car, mistook Waldorf for Martin, and believed he was recognized, he then misinterpreted Waldorf reaching into the back seat as him reaching for a gun. In that split second, under immense pressure and believing his life was in danger from a known armed and violent criminal, he opened fire. Other officers then joined in, with Detective Constable Dean stating he believed he was witnessing an exchange of fire. It's a classic example of the fog of war and confirmation bias, where every movement is seen through the lens of extreme threat.
Fog of war, or not, the fact remains that an innocent man nearly died. And it gets worse. After Finch emptied his revolver, he then pistol-whipped Waldorf until he lost consciousness. This is not self-defense, this is a brutal assault. It speaks volumes about the level of training, or lack thereof, and the mindset that allowed officers to continue using force even when the perceived threat should have been diminishing. It raises serious questions about the de-escalation tactics, or the complete absence of them, in such operations.
And this incident obviously led to a significant public outcry. Charles, how did the Met and the wider police force react to that?
The public reaction was massive, and rightly so. It was a huge black eye for the Metropolitan Police, particularly given Britain's tradition of largely unarmed policing. The incident was raised in Parliament, and the Home Secretary himself promised investigations and reforms. Internally, there was immediate scrutiny. The 3 officers who fired their weapons were suspended, and an investigation by the CIB, the Complaints Investigation Bureau, began immediately. Finch and Jardine were charged with attempted murder and causing grievous bodily harm.
Charges that, I might add, they were ultimately acquitted of. This, for me, is a major point of contention regarding accountability. Despite the fact that an innocent man was shot 5 times and pistol whipped into unconsciousness, the officers walked free. Their defense was a genuine, albeit mistaken, fear for their lives. While fear is a powerful emotion, it cannot be a blanket justification for actions that cause such severe harm to an innocent bystander. This outcome often erodes public trust and sends a message that officers can act with impunity, even in cases of gross negligence.
I understand your concern about accountability, Angela. From a legal standpoint in the UK at the time, the defense of self-defense, even if mistaken, was a strong one. If the jury believed the officers genuinely feared for their lives, however misjudged that fear was, they would be acquitted. It doesn't mean the outcome was good, or that the force used was justified in hindsight, but it speaks to the legal framework they operated under. The Police Federation, in fact, suggested officers should have some degree of legal immunity, highlighting the internal pressures and risks they felt. However, the Met did act. The officers had their firearms authorization revoked, even if they were reinstated to general duties.
And what about the wider reforms mentioned in the text? The new guidelines, the Deer Report, and the creation of authorized firearms officers or AFO units. How significant were these changes?
These reforms were incredibly significant, Alice. The Waldorf shooting, along with other mistaken shootings in the 1980s, was a major catalyst. Before 1983, selected detectives in plain clothes could be trained and carry weapons with permission from an inspector. Post-Waldorf, there were new guidelines. The rank of the authorizing officer was significantly increased, ensuring more senior oversight. The Deer Report, published later that year, recommended crucial changes, psychological assessment and greatly increased training for armed officers. This led to a more standardized approach across forces, emphasizing dedicated, highly trained AFO units, specifically from units like D11, who specialized in armed operations. It shifted from a more ad hoc arming of officers to a professionalized, centralized approach for armed responses. It was a recognition that firearms operations required highly specialized skills and judgment, not just general detective work.
And while those reforms certainly sound like a step in the right direction, Charles, I see them as a classic example of event-driven policymaking, as the text notes. Reforms only came after a tragic, high-profile incident. The fact that the British police reportedly lacked a coherent strategy for developing firearms policy prior to this speaks volumes. Psychological assessment and increased training are essential, but the underlying culture and command structures also need to be robust enough to prevent such catastrophic errors. From a human rights perspective, the emphasis should always be on proportionality, necessity, and the absolute last resort for lethal force, backed by rigorous and ongoing training, not just reactive measures.
It's true that it was reactive, Angela. Most significant policy changes often are. But the impact on the ground was profound. The Met, and indeed all British police forces, became far more disciplined and professional in their approach to firearms. The move towards dedicated AFO units meant that officers carrying guns were not only better trained physically, but also psychologically assessed and subject to far stricter protocols regarding engagement. It was a complete overhaul that shaped modern British policing's approach to armed operations.
And finally, Stephen Waldorf himself did recover and receive compensation. Was that a sufficient outcome, in your views?
Compensation is crucial for victims of police misconduct. It's a recognition of the harm caused. Waldorf received £120,000 to £150,000, and Martin's girlfriend also received £10,000. It's a necessary legal outcome, but can any amount of money truly compensate for being shot 5 times, suffering a fractured skull, and having your life turned upside down by those sworn to protect you? It helps, but it doesn't erase the trauma, nor does it fully address the systemic failures that allowed it to happen.
I agree that no amount of money can truly undo such an experience. But the fact that the Met did not contest the case and offered a substantial out-of-court settlement was an implicit admission of fault and a step towards justice for Waldorf. It indicated a recognition from the institution that a grave error had occurred and that responsibility lay with the police.
That's all for today. A big thank you to our guest researcher, David Morgan, for providing our topic.